So I only just give you context, and then Daniel will come up to share about IBS, and then we're going to go actually do an IBS together. We're going to break up in groups and do an inductive Bible study in small groups. Just to explain how it fits in the overall picture, yeah? So in our manual we have what we call the four great components. It's not maybe ideal, but that is the way I was able to express it the most simple way in the manual, so that the goal with the manual is that people can read it and then actually know how to run it almost without help. I think that's maybe that's impossible, but at least as much as possible that they can run on their own without help. Okay, so my attempt is to try to be as clear as possible. So then the end result is people finish with a grade, right? And so we have what we call the four grade components in page 13. It begins in page 13, and then that is the thing. The grade is decided by these four components: homework, the Bible overview presentation at the end of the school, and then leading inductive Bible study. Usually the students in the school will begin leading the Bible study. And then, of course, personal growth is also mandatory in the U of N. That has to be part of this. Now, so the Bible, when I talk about the weekly homework, the weekly homework is designed to do two things. So you can read that on page 14. Part 1 all has to do with Bible overview presentation. Yeah. Part 2 has to do with small group and so forth, Bible study and application. And so everything in the homework is connected. Timelines, biblical principles, leading a small group. It all has to do with community, Bible study, inductive Bible study, and so forth. So that is kind of like the big picture. And so how does leading a small group fit? Okay, we talk about IBS development. You begin, as part of the homework, they do like a little bit of this and that, but then the goal is that they are leading a Bible study group at the end. Yeah. Now, why is it so powerful to train our students to lead a small group? It's because you're already raising them up to be your staff. Because then they can come back and they know how to run the small group. And the core of the DBS is running good small. The core of the DBS is small group. Therefore, the small group has to be run very well, and that is why we try to spend some extra time on it. You see, when we began with DBS, most of us were SBS folks. And so we kind of know inductive Bible study and so forth. But now we have many that have never done SBS, and they're coming back to staff. So if we can do this right, then it is much easier to multiply, because then they are already half ready to be staff after having been students for 3 months. Now I'm going to give it to Daniel.
All right. So I'm going to go quickly over the model for IBS, and we're going to break into small groups. So you're going to have to listen fast this morning. I would say the most important thing whenever you are doing the inductive method or you're preparing for an IBS, maybe not but one of the, is to flush out all of your preconceived ideas of what the text already says. Throw out all your favorite DTS speaker, throw out your favorite Sunday morning message, throw out your favorite worship song, your favorite message maybe you've preached, because the inductive method is we want the Bible to speak for itself. And we want to see what the Bible says, not what we think it says, or not what we're coming to it, somebody else has told us what it says, and then we're going to read it. That's the deductive method. We don't want to do that. But the first thing you want to do is pray. Always want to start the IBS process with prayer. Before you start reading the Bible, you want to start with prayer. And then, can we guess what step number 2 is? Read. Then you're going to read the passage. That's the next step. And then once you pray and then you read, then you're going to go into your next step, which is the first The first step of the inductive method is you're going to ask observation questions. And the thing that people get tripped up over on observation questions is they throw in what their interpretation of what they're reading in with observation. Observation is very simply, what does the text actually say? Like if I were to do this, the observation is there's a Kleenex on the ground. It is a foot or two away from the chair. And you're just coming in and you are looking at what it says and you're asking questions. Where is the Kleenex? That's not a very good example. I was trying to think of more things to do with the Kleenex. When I was blanking. Yeah. What color is the Kleenex? What is the Kleenex made of? Well, yeah. So questions you can ask in observation is what, where, who, how, but you do not want to ask why. You want to avoid why, because in general, why is an interpretation question. There will be instances where the text will tell you why, like why was he mad? And it says he was mad because something. But just as a general rule, you don't want to ask why. So within the DBS, IBS, you want your students to ask 5 observation questions, okay? And how I do it is I usually like to go through a progression through the passage. I look at the first little area and I go, okay, what is happening here? And then I go to the next thing on what's happening here. Yes?
Was that 5? I thought you said only 4. I thought why was canceled.
You do not, okay, thank you.
Why'd you write them down?
You do not have to ask those questions in that order. I was just giving you an example of types of observation questions. You don't have to go follow that pattern, but your questions just need to be literally what the text says. You want to be like crime scene investigators. They come in and they are not detectives. All they are doing is just marking what happened. They're not going to come in and go, they're going to say, there's a broken window, there's a puddle of blood, there's a knife, the bed is, unmade. They're not going to make conclusions. The detective is going to take that information and interpret. Our job for this first thing is just to literally ask questions. And if your question can be answered with something that is not in the text, it's not an observation question. Okay, so it needs to be literally what the text says, okay? 3.5 of the, it's a weird looking 5. 3.5 of the process is what we have started to call here relevant historical background. Here is where you bring in some understanding as to what's going on. What is going on, and here is, if you remember the homework assignments that we went over, there is historical background in the summary. And the historical background in the summary assignment needs to be something that's not in the text. For this, it can be from the text. It needs to be relevant. The IBS passage that we're going over today in small groups is Genesis 50 with Joseph and his brothers. And part of the relevant historical background that I bring whenever I do that IBS is the fact that Joseph was sold into slavery. I use Genesis 37 as part of my historical background because if you are doing a Bible study somewhere just on Genesis 50 with people who haven't read the Bible, they don't know that Joseph was sold into slavery. So that is good, relevant historical background. And it needs to be something that helps the next step. The next step is interpretation. One thing that's very important with this step is that you are not involved with it yet. You are not thinking, what does this mean to me? You are not thinking, what would this mean today? You are interpreting for the people that are in the text. You're going to think, what would Joseph think of this was going on? Why did his brothers respond that way? And here is where original reader comes in very handy. What would this mean to the people who were reading it originally, the original audience? What would it mean to them? You're interpreting, but you're not interpreting for you yet. This isn't the application of what we do with our lives yet. It is, what does it mean for the people involved in the passage? And you're going to ask for the DBS homework assignment. You're going to ask 5 interpretive questions. So you've prayed, you've read the passage, you have walked through and you have observed. Because a lot of times we read and then you forget what you literally just read. Like for me, if I read something and someone goes, what happened? I'm like, I know this, wait. And so people do that all the time. And so it's super easy, like you read and you go, okay, who are the characters? And then they go, Joseph, brother. And so they actually, what it does is it makes them look harder at the text, and it makes them look at what it actually says. And then you're going to ask your interpretation questions. These 2 steps need to be related. What I mean by that is that if you bring a historical background thing, and then your interpretation questions have nothing to do with that historical background, why did you tell me? Like, it might be super interesting, but if it doesn't add, as far as this assignment goes, if it doesn't add to the interpretations, the guy that I led the DBS with in South Africa said, your historical background needs to be the hooks that you hang your interpretation questions off of. So when I bring the fact that Joseph was sold into slavery, that helps frame your mind as to why would his brothers think that they need forgiveness. You're like, well, they sold him into slavery. Like, yeah, because you're already helping them understand what's going on, and then that's going to help your interpretation questions. Then, and this is the thing that we are leading to, you get to your biblical principle. Whoop, how do you spell biblical? I'm just going to put BP. You get to your biblical principle. And this is... trying to organize my thoughts. This is that application statement that they are pulling from what we just did. Okay, and we'll have an example of that in your small groups. But this is a lesson where if we're talking about, if we're looking at, and your interpretation questions are all kind of hovering around this idea of forgiveness, your students are probably going to be thinking forgiveness. So your biblical principle probably should be something related to what your questions are. But this is the part, I describe the IBS process as kind of like an hourglass. Up here are your observation questions, and then your historical background, and then your interpretation. And then right here is your biblical principle. You can see out here you're broad, you're asking what's going on, where are they, what did he say? And then you go, okay, what did he mean by what he said? How would they have responded to that? Here's what I see from that. And then from the biblical principle, we get to our final step, which is application. Here is where you get real good inductively led application. Once you have looked at the text and you've observed what it actually says, and then you have then interpreted based on historical context what it would have meant to the people in the text, and then you pull some kind of biblical lesson that can be applied from that, and then you start doing application questions. And for the assignment, you want your students, and you want to do 2 application questions. God bless you. And you want them to be open-ended. Things like, how have you held things against people in the past? And then I always do a follow-up application question to that is, how can you walk in better forgiveness? If you can answer the application question with a yes or a no, it's not an application question. You want this, you want them to be able to take what you have just done here and start looking at it at their life and how they can then walk that out. So when I do my application questions, I do it progressively. I go, okay, how have you seen that? How can we walk it out? Does that make some modicum of sense? Okay, it will get clearer because I do have 6 people, including myself, who have an IBS done out, and we're going to go over that in the small group setting. They're going to kind of model how that needs to be done, and then hopefully they can answer questions. And then I want to get back together. I want to give you guys a good amount of time to do this, and we can get back together and do a little bit of discussion. But I will answer a few questions.
Just really quickly.
Yes.
What part of the week is this done in? Is this done at the end of the week? Would they have already read Genesis by the
Good
time
question.
they do this?
So the structure that we normally do, they have one IBS assignment to do every week. And us as staff, we prepare 2 IBS presentations to do for them during the week. And you want to have either read it or going to be reading it that day whenever you do it. So the Genesis 50 IBS that we do with the students, we wait until they've either read Genesis 50 the previous day, or whenever we're getting up to it, then we do it then. I mean, it's kind of up to you when you do it. If it's something where there's a lot going on in the day and I don't have time to do the Genesis 51 in that day, I can say, hey guys, here's the passage that we're going to do an IBS on, but we're going to do it tomorrow. Just kind of make a mental note that we're going to do it, and then you do it the next day. So it's kind of up to you as to when you do it, but we usually do it twice a week. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
I was going to bless you if you sneezed. Yo?
How long is like the average time?
You want to take between 30 and 40 minutes to do it, because you want them to, the goal is to teach them how to lead a Bible study, but you only have a limited amount of time in your small group. So you want to try to take about 30 to 40 minutes, but if you look up and you're having a great discussion and you don't want to stop it, you can let it go for a little bit. But the idea is to have it for that long. The goal of all of this, the goal with your interpretation questions, the goal with your application questions, the goal with this is to get them discussing the Bible. So you want to ask interpretation questions that will make them think, and you want them to start discussing, like, why would Joseph do that? Well, maybe he wanted to do it. Oh, yeah, okay. You don't want your interpretation questions to be found in the text, because you want them to be able to think. That's where why comes in. Why did he respond that way? Why did God make him go through that? Things like that where they can actually discuss.
And I just want to mention that the more you can bring in original reader to interpretation, the better, because that's how you get at what the author was trying to get. So we had this example of slavery and Joseph being sold into slavery. Well, Moses is writing to a whole people group that was put into slavery. So the way that he felt about his brothers, they felt about these Egyptians. And now there's Egyptians traveling with them that they might not have the greatest relationship because of those things. So you take that interpretation to the next level with the original reader, and the biblical principle that the author is trying to share just sort of dawns on you. It doesn't have to be like a struggle of like making it fit, that you have the original reader and that naturally leads to that principle.
Yes, relevant historical background helps open up the biblical principle, like Andrew said. Like if you're bringing in understanding of author, and you know that Moses is writing it, you're like, why would Moses write this? What is Moses trying to communicate with this passage? The original reader, what's going on with the original reader? And if you bring information on original reader, be sure you ask an interpretation question about the original reader. Anytime my students were struggling, or I was struggling finding questions, the first thing was, have you considered the original reader? And they're like, oh. So let that be one of those things that helps drive you in that, bring that understanding whenever you're doing your historical background, so they can understand that the people who are reading it are going through this at the time. And we all know this, that the Bible was written with intent. It was written by a very real person to real people going through real situations. And the more understanding we can bring for what we know to the students and to the people that we're doing this for, outside of a DBS, helping them understand context, then it really makes the Bible come alive. Amen? Did you have a question, Sarah?
Is there at least supposed to be one biblical principle
For this assignment, yes. You want to, and your small group, when we break up into small groups, like the whole idea is you want to ask them what they think, because by nature of you being the small group leader, they're going to think that your answer is the right one. And you don't want to give your answer, because then they start thinking, oh, we already have the answer, I don't need to give answers. So when we get to biblical principle, I usually go, what do you guys think the biblical principle is? And then I have everybody tell me what they think the biblical principle is, and often the biblical principle they get is usually way better than the one that I have. And sometimes I don't even share mine. They're like, what was yours? I'm like, no, I don't want to. Yours is way better. So for the purpose of this homework assignment, one biblical principle, whenever you are when you're grading, whenever you are leading the IBS in a group, you want to be able to ask the question, what do you guys think the biblical principle is? So they can develop the process of looking at this thing that you've created, and that they can then interpret from that. Randy, you had your hand up?
So there is the homework assignment of biblical principles, which are 10, but in the IBS it's 1.
Yes.
And it's similar with when they are presenting their IBS, they only have to have a minimum of 2 interpretation questions. But when they're doing their IBS for homework, they have to have 5. So there's different aspects of this assignment.
Yeah, and what Randy's talking about, we will hit in small group facilitation. I'll go over this, because on the grade sheet it says minimum of 2, but for their homework assignment that they turn in, they need to have 5. Yes.
So part of us leading the IBS is to be example for them when they lead IBS. So when they are doing it for their assignment, would it be okay for them to ask the group what they think the biblical principle is, or do you expect them to?
Talking about for their written homework?
No, for when they lead the IBS.
When they lead IBS, you want them to do it how you've done it.
Okay.
So the whole point of it is to get involvement and not to just listen to what somebody's prepared. Does that make sense? Like people get that enough on Sunday morning where they're listening to a pastor present what they've prepared. So yes, when I grade their presentation, whenever they're doing that in small group, if they just give the biblical principle and they don't ask people what the thing is, I take points off, because we're not here to just hear what they've got. We're here to facilitate people understanding and thinking about the text and then thinking about that. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes?
One more question, just to clarify. So we do this twice a week with the students.
Yes.
They do one written assignment.
Yes.
And then they lead an inductive Bible study near the end of the school? Or when does that
So
happen?
structure-wise, as far as the school, we normally have them lead it weeks 4, 8, and 11.
Each student will lead it.
Each student will lead it 3 times, yes. So when it gets to week 4, all of your students will lead a different IBS passage that week in small group, and that's part of the,
So every day we're doing it. So
for those weeks.
45 minutes to every week.
So say that again?
It tacks on an extra 45 minutes to every
It takes out 30 to 40 minutes of whatever your small group time is, yeah. For those weeks, 4, 8, and 11, those are going to be busy weeks.
Okay, and they're each doing a different passage?
Yes.
And we assign that passage?
Yes. Good question. She's asking, whenever the students lead the IBSs, which we normally do weeks 4, 8, and 11, they do different passages, and we assign those passages to them, because it would be kind of redundant for them to do the same thing over and over again. Yeah. Excellent. Anything else? Yes.
관찰을 할 때 어떻게 해야 되는지 질문하고 싶은데요.
He wants to ask a question about observation.
SBS에서는 관찰 키라는 것을 주어집니다.
So in SBS, there's something called an observation key.
사건이라든지 비교를 한다든지.
Like comparing events.
근데 이 DBS에서 이 관찰의 단계에서 어떻게 관찰을 해야 되는 건지를
Is there a particular method in TBS as well that's particular to TBS that as in like how we should observe things in the Bible?
Do you have a response to that?
Who, what, where, when, how. Those are the 5 things. And so if they're finding something, but they're having a hard time labeling. So the observations we teach in DBS basically fall under 5 categories: who, what, where, when, how. And if students point out an observation, they may have trouble figuring out what category that is. If there's a command, well, is that how that Jesus is communicating, or is it what he's saying to do? So part of the discussion may be how do you get your students to put that observation into the right category. But those are, at the basic level, that's the simplest way to observe. So we don't have observations like the different figures of speech that you learn in SBS, for example.
Yeah. Very good. And we're only doing the inductive method on a passage. So comparing things like, because I know SBS, you do the inductive method on the entire book, and there might be comparisons at the beginning or the ending of the book. And so we do, like, just with the method we have, we're looking at a passage. Sometimes there may not be that. But thank you.
Very good.
Okay, if there's nothing else, curiosity-wise, yeah, yo?
Well, just when you then look at homework, and you look at number 5, I call it IBS development, so that is something you do as homework, but the end goal is again that you know how to run an IBS. That's why it's called IBS development, so there's like every week you do something. Correct me if I misspeak, Daniel, but so that IBS development leads to the end goal of being able to lead a small group. So that homework section contributes also to, like you do it, you practice in your small group, and you do a little bit of homework that you do every week, so that at the end of fall week,
Yeah.
you know. So there's an IBS development.
Yeah, the leading inductive Bible study and the IBS development are paired because they're learning how to do the process, and then they learn to lead it, and then they learn to get better at it, and then hopefully by the end they're comfortable enough to go home and start a women's group, and they can look at Ruth, and they can do an IBS on a section of Ruth. Okay, so I have 6 groups that we can divide up into. So I don't count you, the people who I've asked to lead an